It was one of the most controversial and complex wars of the 20th century. Yet it remains a defining moment for both America and Vietnam. How could the United States, a global superpower armed with the most advanced military technology of the time, fail to defeat a relatively small nation? Why did this conflict last nearly 2 decades, leaving millions dead and entire regions devastated? What made the North Vietnamese so resilient, and why did America struggle to win despite overwhelming firepower? In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, the reasons, the events, and the consequences of the Vietnam War. So, without any delay, let's start. The roots of the Vietnam War stretch far back into history, long before American involvement. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the mid-19th century, and nationalist movements had long simmered beneath the surface. Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary and nationalist, became the leading figure of Vietnam's struggle for independence. He combined communist ideology with a deep commitment to national liberation, presenting a powerful force against colonial rule. After World War II, when Japan briefly occupied the region and then surrendered, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945. However, the French, seeking to reassert control over Indochina, launched military campaigns to retake the territory. This conflict, known as the First Indochina War, was brutal. Ho Chi Minh's forces, organized as the Viet Minh, employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and knowledge of the local terrain to counter the better-equipped French army. The United States initially supported France financially, fearing that communist expansion in Asia would destabilize the region. At the time, the Cold War had begun, and policymakers in Washington were acutely aware of the domino theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. This fear shaped American policy in Southeast Asia and set the stage for deeper involvement in Vietnam. By 1954, the First Indochina War ended in a decisive defeat for France at Dien Bien Phu, shocking the Western world. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with the North controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the South under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, supported by the United States. This division was meant to be temporary, with national elections scheduled to unify the country. However, political distrust, ideological differences, and American fears of communist victory in the South prevented those elections from ever taking place. Instead, the stage was set for a civil war that would eventually draw in global superpowers. American involvement grew gradually. Initially, it consisted of military advisors, economic aid, and support for building South Vietnam's army. By the early 1960s, however, it became clear that South Vietnam could not stand alone against the North. The Viet Cong, communist insurgents in the South, were gaining strength, attacking government officials, ambushing convoys, and undermining Diem's authority. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh and his generals in the North were supplying, training, and coordinating the insurgency, ensuring that communist forces had both manpower and logistical support. The early 1960s also saw the rise of political instability in South Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem, despite being supported by the United States, faced growing dissent. His policies alienated key segments of the population, particularly Buddhists, and his government was seen as corrupt and authoritarian. A series of coups and assassinations destabilized the South Vietnamese state further. American leaders were frustrated, realizing that even with military aid, political and social unrest could not be easily solved. The war was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about controlling territory, and the U.S. struggled to understand the cultural and historical context of Vietnam. By 1964, incidents like the Gulf of Tonkin attack dramatically escalated U.S. involvement. Reports of North Vietnamese attacks on American ships, whether exaggerated or misinterpreted, led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad powers to conduct military operations without a formal declaration of war. This marked the beginning of large-scale American combat involvement. U.S. airstrikes, troop deployments, and logistical support increased rapidly, with the goal of preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Yet the more America tried to control the situation, the more complex and difficult it became. The nature of the conflict itself presented enormous challenges. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were masters of guerrilla warfare. Ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, and tunnels allowed them to strike American forces unexpectedly. Dense jungles, swamps, and mountains provided natural cover, while the civilian population often aided insurgents. Traditional U.S. military tactics, heavy artillery, air bombardments, and search and destroy missions proved insufficient against an enemy who did not fight like a conventional army. Every village captured or base established could be retaken the next day, making territorial gains fleeting and costly. At the same time, the American military faced logistical and strategic challenges. The war was fought thousands of miles from home, stretching supply lines and complicating communications. Helicopters became iconic, allowing rapid troop deployment and medical evacuation. But even these innovations could not overcome the difficulties of terrain, climate, and an enemy who used the environment to its advantage. Napalm, defoliants, and massive bombing campaigns were employed to destroy the jungles and weaken insurgent bases. But these measures often caused civilian casualties, fueling anti-American sentiment and strengthening support for the Viet Cong. Meanwhile, on the home front in the United States, public opinion began to shift. Television brought the realities of war into American living rooms for the first time. Graphic images of firefights, destroyed villages, and wounded soldiers generated outrage and confusion. Protests began on college campuses, spreading to major cities and shaping national discourse. For the first time, military defeat was not only measured on the battlefield, but also in public perception, and the U.S. government struggled to maintain support. Media coverage highlighted the contradictions between American ideals and the brutal realities of the conflict, creating a war that was as much psychological as it was military. The international dimension of the war also added complexity. The North was backed by the Soviet Union and China, receiving weapons, training, and strategic advice. This made Vietnam a proxy battleground in the larger Cold War, turning a local civil war into a global contest between communism and capitalism. Every escalation risked drawing the superpowers into direct confrontation, limiting American options and forcing careful diplomatic calculations even as the fighting intensified. By 1967–1968, the war had reached a critical point. The Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese across South Vietnam, shocked American military leaders and the public alike. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the offensive, the psychological impact was devastating. The idea of an imminent victory evaporated. Television coverage of the fighting, along with images of destroyed cities and civilian suffering, eroded public trust in the government and fueled anti-war protests. It became clear that sheer military might could not guarantee success in a war that required political, social, and cultural understanding. After the Tet Offensive, it became painfully clear that the Vietnam War could not be won through conventional military strategies alone. The United States, despite possessing unparalleled firepower, advanced technology, and millions of troops, faced an enemy who was committed, patient, and intimately familiar with the terrain. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were fighting not just for territory, but for ideology, nationalism, and survival. Every bombing campaign, every search and destroy mission, every assault on a village or jungle stronghold only hardened their resolve. The U.S. found itself trapped in a war of attrition. A war where body counts and territorial gains meant little if the political and social objectives remained unachieved. President Lyndon B. Johnson, aware of the growing domestic unrest and mounting criticism of the war, faced a difficult dilemma. Escalation risked further losses and greater public outrage, while withdrawal risked the collapse of South Vietnam and a communist victory. Amid mounting pressure, Johnson chose not to seek re-election in 1968. Leaving the future of the war in the hands of his successor, Richard Nixon. Nixon implemented a policy of Vietnamization, aiming to gradually reduce American troop presence while building up South Vietnamese forces to assume responsibility for the conflict. At the same time, he authorized secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, seeking to disrupt enemy supply lines and reduce North Vietnamese capabilities. Despite these measures, progress was slow and uncertain. The North Vietnamese demonstrated remarkable resilience, employing guerrilla tactics, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to move troops and supplies, and maintaining strong support networks in rural areas. For the U.S., the war had become increasingly unpopular. The anti-war movement gained momentum, fueled by televised reports of combat, civilian casualties, and incidents such as the My Lai massacre. Protests, draft resistance, and political opposition at home made it clear that the American public was losing confidence in the government's handling of the conflict. The psychological toll on soldiers, civilians, and policymakers alike was immense. By 1973, after years of negotiation and intense diplomacy, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and a political settlement between North and South Vietnam. While it temporarily reduced to direct American involvement, the accords did not guarantee lasting peace. North Vietnam continued to support communist forces in the South, while the South Vietnamese government, weakened by corruption, poor leadership, and declining morale, struggled to maintain control. 2 years later, in 1975, the North launched a final offensive. South Vietnamese forces were quickly overwhelmed, and Saigon fell on April 30th, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The reunification of the country under communist rule was complete. For America, the war was a profound humiliation, a defeat not just on the battlefield but in the hearts and minds of its people. The legacy of the conflict included over 58,000 American deaths, millions of Vietnamese casualties, widespread destruction, and deep social divisions both in Vietnam and at home. The consequences of the war extended far beyond immediate military outcomes. For Vietnam, reunification under a communist government led to political consolidation, land reforms, and eventual recovery, though the country faced decades of economic challenges, international isolation, and rebuilding after intense devastation. The scars of chemical warfare, unexploded ordnance, and displacement haunted generations. The social and cultural impact of the war reshaped Vietnamese society, altering its demographic structure and shaping national identity around resilience and resistance. For the United States, the war was a profound national trauma. Public trust in government was severely eroded, influencing how Americans viewed foreign policy and military interventions for decades to come. The phrase Vietnam Syndrome emerged, describing the reluctance of both policymakers and the public to engage in overseas conflicts after the bitter lessons of Southeast Asia. The war also exposed the limits of military power when divorced from political strategy, cultural understanding, and popular support, leading to reassessments of U.S. military doctrine and foreign policy in the years that followed. Globally, the Vietnam War had significant geopolitical ramifications. It intensified Cold War tensions, highlighting the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, while demonstrating the willingness of superpowers to engage indirectly through proxy conflicts. China and the Soviet Union's support of North Vietnam showcased the strategic importance of alliances and ideological alignment. Meanwhile, the war influenced American relations with other nations, prompting caution and reassessment in future interventions, including conflicts in the Middle East and Latin America. The Vietnam War also transformed military strategy worldwide. Guerrilla warfare, jungle tactics, and insurgency operations were studied extensively, influencing conflicts in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The lessons learned from the limitations of conventional armies and irregular warfare, the importance of understanding local culture, and the significance of media perception changed how militaries and governments approached conflicts. Air power, chemical agents, and advanced technology were insufficient without strategy, intelligence, and political legitimacy. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the war was psychological and cultural. Veterans returned home with deep physical and emotional scars, while a generation of Americans grappled with questions of morality, patriotism, and the cost of foreign intervention. The anti-war movement reshaped American politics, empowering social activism and challenging the government's narrative of military engagement. Films, literature, and art captured the experiences of soldiers and civilians alike, ensuring that the memory of the conflict endured for decades. In the end, the Vietnam War remains a stark lesson in the limits of power and the complexity of modern conflict. It demonstrated that technological superiority and military might do not guarantee victory when faced with determined, ideologically driven opposition. It highlighted the importance of understanding culture, politics, and human resilience in warfare. And it left a permanent mark on two nations, one emerging from devastation to reunification, the other grappling with the lessons of humility, loss, and reflection. As we look back on the Vietnam War, one question remains for you. In a world where superpowers can still intervene in smaller nations, could modern military technology and strategy ever prevent the kind of stalemate and loss that America faced in Vietnam, or are some conflicts unwinnable by design? Share your thoughts in the comments below.